This evening, in our final award, we're recognizing the 200th anniversary of the many and varied contributions of the South Carolina Synod to life among Southern Lutherans and to the larger church. Since 1824, the South Carolina Synod has been an organization of congregations, pastors, members, deacons, who have worked together to do a ministry that is difficult to do just by individuals alone. Now, most of you know that Lutherans were here in the South Carolina long before there was a synod, beginning in the early 1700s. In fact, some of you know that King George III gave land to some of these German peasants in the middle of South Carolina so that they could serve as a buffer between the Indians in the upstate and the rich planters in Charleston below. The idea was the Indians would wipe out the poor German Lutherans first, and then they would send a warning to the low country rich folks down there in Charleston. It took a while for an organization of these Lutherans to stick. It wasn't until 1803 that all Lutherans in the South, from Virginia to Mississippi, formed the Synod of North Carolina and adjacent states. South Carolina was one of those adjacent states. And it took another 20 years before South Carolina, more or less peacefully, withdrew from the mothership to formally organize a separate synod in 1824, as you've already heard, which is the founding date we acknowledge this evening. Over the years, members of the South Carolina Synod have given incredible gifts, not only to their member churches, but to the larger church as well. The Synod was the original founder of this seminary, for example, and kept it alive against all odds during the Civil War, even when the larger church voted to close it down. It founded Newberry College, and later a college dedicated to the education of young women, Summerlin College at Batesburg, a legacy that lives on today through the Summerlin Honors College at Newberry. Through the heroic efforts of Walton H. Griever, for whom our first award was named, it founded Linman Home for the Aged and Helpless in 1911, and on and on and on. I don't know exactly what our ancestors would think of us today, 200 years later. Many of the ministries the Synod supports today would still be recognizable to them: a seminary, a Lutheran college, Lutheran congregations throughout the state. I'd like to think they would be thrilled to see the growth of our Lutheran retreat centers, a network of Lutheran homes that grew out of that home for the aged and helpless, the Synod's support of Lutheran social services, disaster response, and now even outreach into Hispanic ministry and conversations about racial reconciliation. If they were to see the Synod today, with all of its growth and changes, I think they'd probably be a bit dazed. But at the same time, they would probably nod their heads at the realization that one thing remains true, that the world changes, for better and for worse, and that the church's mission is to minister and take that gospel to that changing world, no matter what it looks like. The church of 1824 was not the same church it was a mere 50 years later. By 1874, it had undergone massive controversy, divisions, and had suffered through a disastrous civil war. 50 more years later, it was already 1924. And if the South Carolina Synod of 1924 was not exactly the roaring 20s here, things like electricity and telephones and automobiles sure made it look like a much different world than the post-Civil War church of 1874. Another 50 years later, the church of 1974, with its guitar music and its harvest gold and avocado-covered appliances in many a church kitchen, would have been unrecognizable to the church just 50 years earlier in the 1920s. And the church in 2024 looks back today at the time of the 1970s as quaint and somehow less pressured and less frenetic. Not true, of course, to any of us who lived through the 70s, but that's the benefit and danger of historical forgetfulness. What will the church in South Carolina look like in another 50 years, in 2074? I'm not even going to hazard a guess. My church history professor, H. George Anderson, of blessed memory to many of you, once said historians never predict the future. And I'm not going to contradict my professor. But what I do know is that throughout its 200 years, the South Carolina Synod has grown, changed, and adapted to the needs of its members and the world in its continual efforts to further God's mission. And so on this significant anniversary year, its 200th anniversary, for those efforts and that ministry, the Archives is pleased to present Bishop Jenny Abersher with the 2024 Synodical Award, honoring 200 years of the life and ministry of the South Carolina Synod.
Thank you. I've asked for Deacon Lexianne Graves to join me to receive the award. She, as you know, is the Vice President of the South Carolina Synod.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to the Archives Board for the Synodical Award and for lifting up the 200th anniversary of the South Carolina Synod and all of the many ways that the Synod has changed. Thank you for that, Dr. McArver. But I also want to thank the Archives for the ministry that you do every single day in walking beside our congregations, our institutions, and the people of the South Carolina Synod and the entire region of the church. That is a gift that helps us all to understand, as we preserve our history, that we have a foundation upon which to stand as we look toward the future and we seek to be the ministers in daily life who do the mission and ministry that God is calling us to in that time to come. So thank you for this award on behalf of a very grateful Synod.
I too would be remiss. I appreciate so much of what the Archives Committee has done. The blessed education that I received, not only at the feet of Harvey Huntley as well as Dr. Susan McArver, but just being a part of, dare I say, her story instead of his story, because a part of our history is such too that beginning in the 1970s, women were able to be ordained, and so I do wonder at what point persons in 1924 may have thought about a female bishop, right, and dare I say a female vice president. Right, and both of this occurring at the same time. So thanks be to God that in the year 2024 we can definitely see into the heart of who we all are as children of God, just as God sees into each one of our hearts. It doesn't necessarily see us by gender or by color or by race, but truly looks upon the heart. So again, all of that goes out to the South Carolina Synod, all of those who are a part of the seminary community and the Archives community who have breathed, eaten, slept, and dare I say, stayed up with us late at night, even here on the seminary campus, but that you have poured into us as leaders, and so that we may continue to pour out to you. So thank you to all of you for this evening and this award.